Here is the story you were taught. A small free people, outnumbered, outgunned, living on a rocky peninsula at the edge of the known world, stood against the largest empire the earth had ever seen. They held. Against every conceivable odd, they won. They saved Western civilization. They saved democracy. They saved freedom itself. You know this story. Everyone does. Here is the problem: it isn't true. Within a decade of their great victory, the Greeks who claimed to be fighting for freedom had built their own empire. They were taxing cities that didn't want to pay. They were crushing rebellions by allies who tried to leave. They were using the blood of the men who died at Marathon, at Thermopylae, at Salamis, to justify conquest. The freedom they celebrated was never meant for everyone, and the men who actually won these wars, and the brilliant, ruthless, calculating men who made every critical decision, knew it the entire time. So forget the textbook version. The real question is not how Greece defeated Persia. The real question is, what were they actually fighting for? The answer changes everything. To understand the Persian Wars, you first have to destroy an illusion. There was no Greece, not in the way we use the word. In 499 BC, the year everything begins, what existed was a fractured landscape of rival city-states scattered across the Aegean basin, each with its own laws, its own gods, its own army, and its own carefully cultivated resentments toward its neighbors. Athens and Corinth traded insults and occasionally blows. Sparta and Argos had been enemies for generations. The island of Aegina, sitting in the bay south of Athens like a permanent provocation, maintained its own fleet, its own trade networks, and treated Athenian pretensions with open contempt. These people spoke dialects of the same language. They worshipped versions of the same gods. They competed in the same athletic games, but they were not a nation. They did not think of themselves as one. Unity was not their instinct. Competition was. On the other side of the Aegean, across the narrow stretch of water separating the Greek mainland from the Anatolian coast, sat the western frontier of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Let the scale of that register. Persia stretched from the Indus River in the east to the borders of Libya in the west. From the steppes of Central Asia to the Persian Gulf, it encompassed Egypt, Babylon, Lydia, Ionia, Thrace, dozens of once independent kingdoms reduced to satrapies, administrative provinces governed by officials who answered to the King of Kings in Susa. The Achaemenid Empire did not rule by simple terror, though terror was always available. It ruled by integration. You could keep your language, your customs, your local gods. You paid tribute. You acknowledged Persian supremacy. You sent troops when called. You stayed inside the system. The system worked. It had been working for over a century. And along the western Aegean coast of Anatolia, in cities called Miletus and Ephesus and Smyrna, were Greek-speaking people, Ionians, descendants of colonists who had settled the coast centuries earlier. They traded with mainland Greece. They shared the same literary tradition, the same religious festivals, the same pride. But they lived under Persian authority. They paid Persian tribute, and increasingly, in the years approaching 500 BC, they found that authority not just uncomfortable but economically strangling. The Persians installed local Greek tyrants as their administrative agents, men who owed their position entirely to Persian backing, and who therefore served Persian interests, not their own citizens' welfare. One of these men was Aristagoras, governor of Miletus. In 499 BC, Aristagoras made a decision that set the entire catastrophe in motion, not out of principle but out of desperation. He had staged a spectacular military failure, a botched naval expedition that had left him exposed to Persian punishment. Ruined. Finished. Unless he could create a crisis large enough to make his personal disaster disappear inside something bigger. So he lit a fire. He urged the Ionian cities to throw off their Persian-backed tyrants. He called it liberation. He called it freedom. Then he went to mainland Greece looking for someone else to hold the burning building while he figured out his next move. He went to Sparta first. Sparta was the dominant land power in Greece, the most feared army in the Hellenic world. If any city could challenge Persia, it was Sparta. Aristagoras made his pitch. The Spartan king Cleomenes listened carefully and then asked one question. How far is Susa from the Aegean coast? 3 months' march, Aristagoras admitted. Cleomenes told him to leave. Sparta would not send its army 3 months from the sea, into territory it didn't know. against an empire it had never fought, for cities it had no particular reason to care about. The calculation was cold, pragmatic, and completely rational. Sparta had its own problems. Helots to suppress, rivals to watch, a Peloponnesian sphere to maintain. Greece's greatest military power looked at the Persian Empire and decided the risk wasn't worth it. So Aristagoras went to Athens, and here the entire story pivots. Athens in 499 BC was not a great power. It was a young democracy, barely a decade old after the reforms of Cleisthenes in 508 BC. Its navy was small. Its army was competent but unremarkable. In the grand hierarchy of Aegean power, Athens was a secondary player, ambitious, restless, and still figuring out what it was capable of. The Athenian assembly voted to send 20 ships to support the Ionian revolt. 20 ships. It wasn't a great military commitment. It was a signal, a public declaration, backed by the full authority of a democratic vote, that Athens considered itself part of the broader Ionian Greek world and was willing to act on that belief. They should not have sent those 20 ships. The Ionians and Athenians marched inland together and burned Sardis, the great Persian provincial capital of western Anatolia. The city's temple burned with the rest of it. Then the Athenians got back on their ships and sailed home, leaving the Ionians to face the consequences alone. The Persian response was systematic and devastating. It took 5 years, but by 494 BC the revolt was crushed. Miltiades, a cultural capital of Ionia, one of the great cities of the ancient world, was destroyed. Its men were killed. Its women and children were deported to a settlement near the mouth of the Tigris, thousands of miles from any world they knew. When the news reached Athens, the playwright Phrynichus staged a drama about the fall of Miltiades. The audience wept. The Athenian government fined him 1,000 drachmas for reminding them of their own culpability and banned further performances of the play. Athens knew what it had done. It had reached into a fire, pulled back its hand, and let others burn. It had also, in doing so, put its name on a Persian list. There is a story, almost certainly embellished but worth telling for what it reveals, that when Darius the Great heard what Athens had done, he asked his servants who the Athenians were. When they told him, he ordered one of them to approach him at dinner every day and say 3 words before the meal began. "Master, remember the Athenians." Whether or not he actually did this, the sentiment is historically accurate. Athens had made a choice. Empires do not forget choices. Darius did not send an army immediately. He sent heralds. In 491 BC, Persian ambassadors traveled to Greek city-states across the mainland with a straightforward demand: earth and water. The traditional tokens of submission, symbolic gifts of soil and sea that meant a city accepted Persian authority. Many cities complied. Thessaly submitted. Boeotia submitted. Aegina, Athens' bitter rival in the Saronic Gulf, submitted. That last one mattered enormously. Persian-aligned Aegina sat directly across from Athens' harbor. It could strangle Athenian trade routes at will. Athens had just been handed a neighbor who answered to the empire it was about to fight. Sparta threw the Persian heralds into a well and told them to help themselves to earth and water from the bottom. Athens put the heralds on trial and executed them. Both cities had just committed acts that, under the customs of the ancient world, were diplomatic outrages with only one possible consequence. There was no walking it back, no negotiation, no alternative interpretation. War was coming. Both cities knew it. The following year, 490 BC, Darius dispatched a punitive expedition, not the full weight of Persian power, that was still being assembled, but a targeted strike force commanded by generals Datis and Artaphernes, with specific orders: punish Eretria and Athens for their role in the Ionian revolt. Bring their citizens back in chains. Eretria, a city on the island of Euboea that had also sent ships to Ionia, lasted 6 days. A faction inside the city opened the gates. The Persians burned the temples, enslaved the population, and deported them to Mesopotamia. Then they crossed to the mainland of Attica. They landed at Marathon. The Bay of Marathon was chosen deliberately, a shallow crescent of beach backed by a marsh on one side and hills on the other, roughly 26 miles northeast of Athens. Flat terrain ideal for Persian cavalry. The Persians expected to fight the kind of battle they always won. The Athenians had to decide whether to march out and meet them there, or wait behind their walls and hope. 10 generals held command of the Athenian army, rotating daily. The vote on whether to fight was deadlocked, 5 in favor, 5 against. Into this deadlock stepped Miltiades. He was a veteran, a former governor of a Greek colony in the north who had operated under nominal Persian suzerainty for years. He had seen how the Persian military actually worked. He understood its formations, its assumptions, its vulnerabilities. He argued for immediate engagement with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Every day of delay let the Persians consolidate their beachhead. Let potential traitors inside Athens make contact with the enemy. Let fear do its slow, corrosive work on Athenian morale. The polemarch, a magistrate with a casting vote, sided with Miltiades. The Athenians marched. What happened at Marathon was not the underdog miracle that later generations would celebrate. It was the application of specific tactical intelligence to a specific enemy weakness. Persian infantry relied on a strong center, their best troops heavily armored in the middle, with lighter, more numerous forces on the flanks. Miltiades designed his formation around this knowledge. He thinned his own center to a dangerously few ranks. He packed his flanks. Then he did something almost unheard of in hoplite warfare. He ordered the line to advance at a run. Heavy armor, midsummer heat, nearly a mile of open ground. The Persian archers had almost no time to work before the Greeks were on top of them. The thin Athenian center absorbed the Persian thrust and gave ground. Just enough, just controlled enough. The reinforced flanks broke through the lighter Persian wings and wheeled inward. The Persian center was suddenly fighting on 3 sides. The line shattered. The Persians ran for their ships. The killing on the beach lasted until dark. Final count: 6,400 Persians dead, 192 Athenians. The numbers tell the story. But Marathon's real significance was not the body count. It was the proof, permanent, undeniable, historically unprecedented, that a Greek army could beat a Persian army in open battle. The Persian Empire was not supposed to lose. It had never lost like this. Athens had done it alone, without Spartan help, and the story of that fact would reshape the entire Greek world's understanding of what Athens was and what Athens could become. For Persia, Marathon was an embarrassment, not a strategic defeat. The expedition had been punitive in scale, not total. Plans for a true invasion, massive, irresistible, designed to make the question of resistance irrelevant, began almost immediately. Darius died in 486 BC before he could launch it. He left the task to his son. He left the task to Xerxes. Xerxes was not his father. Darius had been a builder, of roads, of administrative networks, of the ceremonial capital at Persepolis. He understood empire as an organism that needed constant maintenance. The Persian Wars, to him, were a disciplinary problem on the western frontier. Serious but not personal. For Xerxes, the invasion of Greece became something else entirely. Something that needed to announce itself to the whole world as a demonstration of Achaemenid supremacy. Over every force, every principle, every geographical obstacle that might dare to suggest limits existed on Persian power. The preparations were deliberately, almost theatrically, staggering. A bridge of boats was constructed across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. When a storm destroyed the first bridge, Xerxes reportedly had the sea itself flogged 300 times with chains. Then he had a second bridge built. A canal was cut through the Mount Athos Peninsula, the rocky headland that had wrecked an earlier Persian fleet in 492 BC, so the navy could pass without rounding the dangerous cape. Supply depots were positioned along the route at intervals. A road was prepared. This was not improvisation. This was an imperial logistics operation of a scale the Greek world had never seen and could barely comprehend. The army itself was multinational in a way modern readers sometimes forget. Persians, Medes, Lydians, Bactrians, Sake, Indians, Arabs, Ethiopians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Thracians. Conservative modern estimates put the force at somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 men. The fleet, 600 to 800 warships. The message Xerxes was sending with all of this was not military. It was existential. Resistance is irrational. Resistance is insane. Resistance is the decision of people who have not yet understood what empire means. And here's the thing, most Greeks agreed with him. When Persian heralds arrived again in 481 BC demanding submission, Thessaly complied. Boeotia complied. Argos, Sparta's ancient enemy, declared neutrality, submission by another name. Even the oracle at Delphi, the supreme religious authority of the Greek world, was deeply pessimistic. The oracle told Athens its walls would be destroyed, its people slaughtered. The small coalition that did form to resist Persia, led by Sparta on land, Athens at sea, held together not through shared values but through shared terror. And even that was barely enough, because the city that would determine the outcome of the entire war was in the middle of its own internal revolution. His name was Themistocles, the son of a man of middling status and a non-Athenian mother, an outsider by the standards of the Athenian elite, which made him hungry in ways that insiders never are. He had risen through the assembly on the strength of rhetoric, political instinct, and a tactical intelligence that seemed almost unnatural in its ability to see 10 years ahead. And what Themistocles saw long before anyone else was willing to see it was this: Athens's future was not the land. It was the sea. Not the phalanx, not the aristocratic hoplites with their bronze armor and inherited prestige. The Aegean, the trading lanes, the islands, the entire maritime geography of a world that Athens sat at the center of, if only Athens had the ships to claim it. In 483 BC, the silver mines at Laurion in southern Attica struck an extraordinary new vein. The windfall was significant, enough for a direct payment to every Athenian citizen if the assembly voted for it. That was the obvious move, the popular move, the move every other politician would have made. Themistocles proposed using the silver to build a fleet, 200 triremes. The trireme was the warship of the age. Long, narrow, built for speed and ramming, brutally effective in trained hands. 200 of them meant creating a naval power nearly from scratch. It meant training thousands of rowers, not armored aristocrats, but the poorest Athenians. The Thetes, the men at the bottom of the property classifications who had always been militarily irrelevant. Themistocles did not sell this as a war against Persia. He was too smart for that. He sold it as a war against Aegina, Athens's insufferable neighbor across the bay. Local, comprehensible, urgent. The real ambition, global naval dominance. A fleet capable of projecting Athenian power across the entire Aegean, was hidden inside a quarrel about trade routes. The assembly voted yes. This is the actual turning point of the Persian Wars. Not Marathon, not Thermopylae, not Salamis. Those battles were fought over days. The fleet was built over years, through sustained political will and sustained funding, against the resistance of a wealthy class that understood perfectly well what a naval strategy meant for them. It shifted military power from men who could afford bronze and iron to men who could only afford oars. Themistocles was building a new Athens disguised as a defense project. And he was building it because he believed, correctly, as it turned out, and that Persia was coming back in force, and that the only way to survive was at sea. When Xerxes crossed the Hellespont in spring of 480 BC, the Greek coalition moved first to defend the Vale of Tempe in northern Thessaly. That position lasted approximately 1 week before the Greeks realized it could be outflanked. They retreated south. The next line was Thermopylae, a coastal pass in central Greece where the mountains pressed so close to the sea that only a narrow track ran between them, barely wide enough for a cart. In the right hands, it could be held against any number of attackers because the pass allowed only a few men to fight at a time. Numbers, Thermopylae's defenders calculated, would mean nothing there. King Leonidas of Sparta led 300 Spartan citizens to hold that pass. With him were several thousand allied Greek troops: Thespians, Corinthians, Mycenaeans, Phocians, others. The Persian fleet simultaneously engaged the Greek fleet at Artemisium, a cape at the northern tip of Euboea. The strategy was integrated and dependent on both halves holding simultaneously. Control the land corridor and the sea corridor at the same time, using terrain to cancel Persian numerical superiority. For 2 days it worked. The Persians attacked the pass again and again. Forces trained for open battle tried to force a front that could barely fit a company across. Spartan discipline, Spartan tactical flexibility, and the brutal efficiency of heavy infantry in a space where Persian numbers were useless. All of it held. The Persians took losses that must have been genuinely shocking for an army that expected this to be a brief formality. Then a man named Ephialtes walked into the Persian camp. He was a local Greek, a Malian from the territory immediately around Thermopylae, He knew these mountains the way only a native knows them, and he knew something the defenders apparently hadn't fully accounted for. There was another path. A mountain track, steep and winding, that rose above the pass and came down directly behind the Greek position. He sold that information to Xerxes for a reward. Xerxes sent his immortals, his elite troops, up the track in the dark. A Phocian force positioned to guard the path heard them coming, panicked and retreated to higher ground. The immortals came through. Leonidas knew by dawn what had happened. He sent the allied Greek forces south. Some were ordered away. Some chose to go. But the Thespians had nowhere to retreat to. Their city sat directly in the Persian line of march and would be destroyed regardless. 700 Thespians stayed. Leonidas stayed with his 300. Why? Sparta had a prophecy. Either a Spartan king would die at Thermopylae or Sparta itself would fall. Leonidas may have understood that his death, chosen, deliberate, staged at the exact moment of maximum visibility, was worth more to Sparta than any tactical retreat. A Spartan king who abandoned a pass was a catastrophe. A Spartan king who died holding one was a permanent argument. They died holding it. While Thermopylae collapsed, the Greek fleet at Artemisium was fighting to a costly draw, inflicting real damage on the Persian navy, but absorbing losses it couldn't afford, and losing ships it couldn't replace. When word came that the pass had fallen, the fleet withdrew. The road south was open. Athens lay directly in the path of the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled, and Themistocles made a decision so radical, so counterintuitive, that it is still almost impossible to fully absorb, even knowing how it ended. He evacuated Athens. Not the fighting men, they were already at the ships. He evacuated everyone else, women, children, the elderly, by sea and by road to the island of Salamis, to the Peloponnese, to any city that would take Athenian refugees. The Acropolis, the sacred rock at the center of Athens, the home of the goddess Athena. The physical and spiritual heart of the polis was defended by a small rear guard who interpreted the Delphic oracle's wooden walls, literally, barricading themselves behind wooden stakes. The Persians killed them. Then the Persians burned everything. The sacred olive tree of Athena burned. The statues burned. The temples burned. The Parthenon of that era, not the one we know, which came later and burned. Athens was gone. Hold that fact for a moment. The city at the center of this entire story was destroyed, not besieged, not occupied as a going concern, burned to the foundations, and Themistocles was not broken by it. He was, if anything, freed by it. There was nothing left to protect. There was only the fleet. The Greek fleet had gathered in the strait between the island of Salamis and the Attic mainland. Narrow water, 1 to 2 kilometers wide, and inside that coalition, a furious argument was consuming whatever unity remained. The Peloponnesian commanders, Corinthians, Spartans, Aeginetans, wanted to retreat further south. Fight at the Isthmus of Corinth, where a defensive wall was being built, protect their own cities. Athens is already ash, they argued. Why hold at Salamis? Themistocles made the case for staying with everything he had. The strait was exactly the kind of terrain where the Greek fleet's advantages, speed, precision, the tight maneuvering that Athenian rowers had practiced for years, could neutralize Persian numerical superiority. In open water, the Persians would overwhelm them by sheer mass. In the strait, mass would become a liability. He was right, but he was losing the argument. The Peloponnesians held the votes. The fleet was going to leave. So Themistocles did something that has no good name in any language. He sent a slave and a trusted man named Sisinus to the Persian fleet with a message. His own message in his own name. The message said, the Greek alliance is about to collapse. The fleet is planning to flee tonight. If the Persians move now, they can seal both exits from the strait and trap the Greeks before they escape. The message was true, partly true. The alliance was genuinely on the verge of dissolution. The Greek commanders were genuinely debating retreat. Themistocles simply made sure that information arrived at Persian headquarters at exactly the moment it would trigger exactly the response he needed. The Persians moved their fleet overnight to block both exits. By dawn, the Greek fleet was enclosed. There was nowhere to go. The debate about whether to fight at Salamis was over, because Salamis was now the only option that existed. Themistocles had resolved his political problem by alerting his enemy to the one truth that made retreat impossible. He had saved the Greek alliance by betraying it to Persia. The man who won the Persian Wars was not a patriot in any simple sense. He was something more dangerous, a strategist who understood that the goal mattered more than the method, and that survival required doing things that could not be explained until after they worked. Xerxes had his throne carried to a hillside overlooking the strait at dawn. He brought secretaries to record the names of commanders who distinguished themselves. This was going to be the culminating spectacle of the entire campaign, the moment his navy entered that narrow water and destroyed the last organized resistance in the Aegean. He had already burned Athens. He had already broken the pass at Thermopylae. The war was supposed to be ending. What happened instead was the most perfectly engineered military catastrophe in the ancient world. The Persian fleet was massive. The Phoenician warships at its core were among the finest naval assets anywhere in the Mediterranean. Experienced crews, fast ships, well-maintained. The fleet entered the strait in columns in good order, confident. They expected to find the Greeks attempting a desperate last stand, or perhaps still arguing about whether to flee. What they found was a Greek fleet in disciplined formation, waiting. The strait did exactly what Themistocles had calculated it would do. The lead Persian ships entering the narrowing channel couldn't deploy into combat formation without slowing down, and the ships behind them had nowhere to go except into the ships in front of them. The numerical advantage that had made the Persian fleet terrifying in open water became, in the confines of the strait, a logistical catastrophe. Ships designed to maneuver freely found themselves crowded, blocking each other, unable to bring their rams to bear without crashing into their own allies. The Phoenician left wing, entering first, found itself squeezed against the shore of Salamis before it could properly engage. The Athenian and Aeginetan triremes came in low and hard, bronze ram at the waterline, oars hooked and snapped to disable ships, boarding parties where the opportunity existed. The water filled with wreckage. Persian ships unable to reverse in the chaos rode into each other. Men in heavy armor sank immediately. Persians who made it to the shore of Salamis were killed by Athenian soldiers waiting on the beach. Xerxes watched from his hillside. He had brought the secretaries to record acts of distinction. By afternoon, he had nothing to record except the systematic destruction of his navy in a channel that was supposed to have been a killing ground for Greeks. The battle was over. The Persian fleet withdrew. Hundreds of ships destroyed or captured. The Phoenician contingent, the backbone of Persian naval power, shattered. Without naval supremacy, the Persian army in Greece could not be reliably supplied across the Aegean. It could not be reinforced if things went wrong. The entire strategic equation that Xerxes' own advisor Artabanus had tried to explain before the campaign, that both the sea and the land would become enemies if something failed, had resolved itself in the worst possible way. Xerxes left before winter. He took a significant portion of the army with him, leaving his general Mardonius with a large, experienced force to winter in Thessaly and resume the campaign the following year. The war was not over. But the war that continued was a different war. The next summer, 479 BC, the Greek coalition fielded the largest hoplite army in its history. Roughly 40,000 heavy infantry, led by the Spartan regent Pausanias, and met Mardonius on the flat plains near Plataea in Boeotia. The Greeks were attempting a complex nighttime withdrawal when Mardonius, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of exposed movement, ordered the pursuit. The Greek formation turned and fought. In the close quarters combat that followed, Mardonius was killed. Without its commander, the Persian force disintegrated. The pursuit was merciless. Tens of thousands died. On the same day, or within days of it, the Greek fleet destroyed what remained of the Persian navy at Mycale on the Ionian coast. The Persian Wars, in their conventional sense, were over. Persia would never invade Greece again. The textbooks end here. They shouldn't. What happened next is the part nobody puts in the celebrated story. Within months of Plataea, Athens began rebuilding its walls. Not to the old dimensions, bigger, stronger, faster. Sparta objected. Themistocles stalled the Spartan ambassadors in conversation, while Athenian workers finished construction around the clock. Then he told Sparta, "The walls are built. Come inspect them if you like." Sparta did not come. The alliance that had saved Greece was already decomposing. In 478 BC, Athens organized the surviving city-states and Aegean islands into a new coalition. Its treasury sat on the sacred island of Delos. Its stated purpose was collective defense against any future Persian aggression. Cities that could contribute warships did so. Cities that couldn't contributed money instead. The alliance was called the Delian League. It sounded like liberation. It functioned like something else entirely. Themistocles had built the fleet. His successor in Athenian politics, Cimon, built the empire that fleet made possible. The Delian League conducted aggressive campaigns into Persian-controlled Aegean territory, liberating Ionian cities, pushing Persian forces off islands, eventually destroying what remained of Persian naval power at the Battle of the Eurymedon in 466 BC. Genuine military achievements. They also generated tribute in enormous quantities, and cities that had joined a defensive alliance found themselves unable to leave it. Naxos tried to secede in the 460s. Athens besieged it into submission. Thasos tried to withdraw in 465 BC. Athens blockaded it for 3 years, stripped it of its fleet, and forced it back into the league on punitive terms. The logic was always the same. We are protecting you from Persia. Your tribute is the cost of that protection. To leave is betrayal. Sound familiar? In 454 BC, the Delian League treasury was moved from Delos to Athens. The official justification was practical. Delos was too exposed. The money needed better security. The actual effect was total. Athens now held the money, controlled the accounts, and decided how it was spent. A significant portion went to building the Parthenon, the most magnificent temple in the Greek world, funded by tribute extracted from cities that had no vote on its construction and received nothing from its beauty. By the time Pericles delivered his celebrated funeral oration in the 440s, the speech Thucydides preserved, and that subsequent centuries held up as the definitive articulation of democratic values, Athens was governing an empire of roughly 300 subject cities, collecting 600 talents of tribute per year, deploying military force across the Aegean, the Black Sea, and the Eastern Mediterranean, planting Athenian colonists on land seized from defeated allies who were technically still members of the same league. Pericles said in that speech that Athens was an education to Greece. He was right, just not in the way he meant. And then there is the final irony, the one that closes the circle completely. The Persian Wars did not end Persian influence in Greek affairs. They transformed it. While Athens was building its empire, Sparta was watching, and growing alarmed in exactly the way that powerful neighbors grow alarmed when something nearby starts becoming more powerful than them. The Peloponnesian War, which began in 431 BC and ran for 27 years, was triggered not by Persian aggression, but by Athenian imperial expansion. Corinth brought the complaint to the Spartan assembly. Athens was everywhere. Athens was encircling them. Athens, the city that had saved Greece from Persia, had become the thing Greece needed saving from. The war lasted 27 years. Halfway through it, in 412 BC, after Athens had destroyed itself with a catastrophic military expedition to Sicily, Sparta signed a treaty with Persia. Persian money paid for the rowers who manned the Spartan fleet. Persian money rebuilt Spartan naval power after decades of Athenian dominance at sea. Persian money was the principal reason Sparta eventually won. The men who had fought at Thermopylae, at Salamis, at Plataea, some of them still alive in 412 BC, old now, their armor too heavy for their aging bodies, lived to see Sparta accept Persian gold to fight Athens. And then it got worse. In 387 BC, after decades of intermittent warfare following the Peloponnesian War, the king's peace was imposed on the entire Greek world. Its terms were dictated by Artaxerxes II, King of Kings in Susa. The Greek city-states, exhausted, bankrupt, incapable of reaching any agreement among themselves, accepted Persian arbitration. Under the peace, Persia formally reasserted control over Ionia, the Greek cities of Asia Minor that Athens had liberated through the Delian League, that Cimon had fought to free, that the men at Marathon had died to protect, given back, handed over, traded for stability and a Persian guarantee that nobody would destabilize mainland Greek politics further. The freedom Greece claimed to have won in 480 BC was surrendered in 387 BC. Less than a century later, without a Persian army in sight, surrendered by the Greeks themselves to the same empire because it was convenient. So what were they really fighting for? Not freedom. The word is too clean for what was actually happening. What Athens was fighting for was the right to control its own future, to not be integrated into a Persian administrative system that would have reduced Athens from a power to a province. That is a real thing to fight for. It is not nothing. The desire to determine your own political fate, to make your own mistakes, to build your own city on your own terms, these drove real men to real acts of courage at Marathon and Salamis and Plataea. But it was never about universal freedom. It was about Athenian freedom. The freedom to become exactly what Athens then became, an empire that taxed cities that didn't want to pay, crushed allies that tried to leave, and used the language of collective defense to justify the reality of dominance. The deeper truth, the one that makes the Persian Wars genuinely important beyond the military spectacle, is what the war reveals about the relationship between power and legitimacy. Athens needed a story. Every empire needs a story. The one Athens chose was the best one available. We were the people who stood against the greatest power in the world and refused to break. We did it for all of Greece. We paid for it with our city, our homes, our dead. The story was true, and having told it, Athens used it to justify everything that followed. This is not cynicism. The men who ran across the plain at Marathon, the sailors who rowed into the strait at Salamis, their courage was real. Their sacrifice was real. But bravery does not produce freedom. Bravery produces victory. Victory produces power. And power has its own logic, a logic that expands, that self-justifies, that finds reasons why this time for us the rules are different. The Athenians believed it was different. That is precisely what made them dangerous. Empires that know they are empires can be contained, can be negotiated with, can eventually be reformed or replaced. Empires that believe they are freedom's champions, that believe their dominance is the necessary condition for everyone else's liberation, those empires burn the hardest and fall the farthest. Look at what Athens built on the ruins of the Persian invasion. Look at what it became. Look at what it did to the cities that trusted it. Then look at the speeches. The magnificent, famous speeches about democracy and participation, and the glory of being Athenian. The speeches are still beautiful. That is the point. The Persian Wars were not a story about freedom. They were a story about what people do with power once they have convinced themselves they deserve it. And that story has never, not once, not in 2,500 years, stopped being told.